I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome you all to this year's Neal's Yard annual lecture, Rethinking How We Think and the Wider Implications of Our Decisions and Actions. The inaugural Neal's Yard lecture last year was on the topic of overpopulation. This opened a debate about how we can start to look at using our creative and design talent to not only consider the issue of population growth, but what that means in terms of our culture, education, and our practice as creative problem solvers. One of the main points which came out of the debate is that we need a radical change in our thinking to address some of the big challenges we face today. One of the reasons that we introduced psychology into the college a couple of years ago as a new discipline at postgraduate level was to try and understand how we might properly begin to support the industry and consumers in moving beyond our usual way of thinking and responding, which is to focus on the short-term action. As a college, we are acutely aware of the problems with fast fashion, and we know we need to look to the long term to take action now, and we have realised that this is something, as humans, we find difficult. With this in mind, we've invited two experts, Professor Avner Offer and Dr. Henrietta Bowden-Smith, to present their interpretations of this question, of the rethinking of how we think, and to help us continue the debate amongst our staff and students. They will present their ideas and about how we might tackle the social and environmental problems of today and how we can help foster new and sustainable approaches to how we live our lives. This way, we might have a long-term sustainable future and one with a greater sense of purpose and well-being. I would like to thank Juliet and Peter Kindersley, who have so kindly supported this event and who in many ways are behind the student competition, which you can read more about on our Sustainable Fashion website. The student competition will challenge you, all of our students, to create your own project brief in direct response to the lecture this evening. For the chance to win an award, you'll be asked to define and articulate your own learning by writing the brief you would want both yourself and fellow students, and perhaps those that will follow you in years to come, to answer a brief that is central of this year's lecture. A video of the lecture will also be made available online after the event, in case you miss all the details. I would now like to introduce our speakers this evening, and we are really privileged to have them both here tonight. Professor Avner Offer is Professor of Economic History at the University of Oxford. As an expert in social and economic history, Professor Offer will be able to offer the expert interpretation of the suggestion of the need to change our thinking from a social sciences perspective. And he will challenge our assumptions and give us insight into how we think. Dr. Henrietta Bowden-Jones is a medical doctor and neuroscience researcher working as a consultant psychiatrist in addictions. She is an honorary senior lecturer in the Division of Brain Science at Imperial College London, and the current co-recipient of Medical Research Council grants in the area of decision-making and impulsivity. As founder and director of the National Problem Gambling Clinic and the Royal College of Psychiatrists spokesperson on behavioural addictions and problem gambling, Henrietta's expertise in these areas can help us understand the processes involved in decision-making and whether or not they are changeable from the perspective of a psychiatrist. Both have their individual views, and the purpose of this evening's event is to open up the discussion on how we begin to better understand how we think and what that means in terms of the decisions we make and the actions we take. I would now like to invite Henrietta to begin.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. I have spoken about gambling and problem gambling in a casino, and I have spoken about alcohol dependency in a pub. So being here on Oxford Street talking about shopping addiction feels fine to me, rather unusual, but fine. I love being here, and I look forward to the cross-pollination that will happen when I can hear people's thoughts about the presentation and the economic perspective on this. So my talk will be about whether there is actually an addiction to shopping or not. Some of my colleagues will say yes, definitely, and others would think that it is the most ridiculous thing I've ever said in my professional career. So I've got some evidence to show you what is happening around the world in terms of perceiving compulsive shopping as an addiction, and then I think we can sort of make up our minds as a unit here today. I'm going to describe the illness a little bit. I'm going to call it the illness, I'm going to call it an addiction, but I do have some reservations as to whether it goes that far. But certainly I can talk to you about this clinical manifestations that can be quite severe, how we tell whether someone's got a problem or not, and a little bit about the neuroscience behind it, and of course the treatment. What I must say is that I actually am an addictions specialist. I have spent my life treating heroin addicts who inject all over their bodies and need help with that. I crack cocaine, all sorts of very severe illnesses, people who are dying of liver disease because of the alcohol dependency. And when I've dealt with the behavioral addictions, they have been on the severe end. So the people who present at my clinic in Soho are people who've often lost their home due to problem gambling, who's sometimes have lost their own home and their parents' home when the parents try to help them. These are people without marriages, without contact with children because of the chaos that gambling has created. And equally, gaming addiction is a really serious behavioral problem at the moment, and we have people who are experiencing significant adverse consequences. I cannot say the same about shopping addiction, but I was very excited about the idea of doing a bit of research into it and bringing it to you. I just wanted to thank, in particular, Dr. Murali for a wonderful article on shopping addiction, from which a lot of my slides come from, but also Donald Black, who is one of the big names in this area. And I put Shopaholics Anonymous here just in case any of you have this problem, and then you can kind of go on the website and help yourselves. So it was first described as an illness by a German psychiatrist called Kraepelin almost a century ago. At the time, he called the illness oniomania, from onios meaning for sale and mania meaning insanity. And so those who were buying a lot were buying maniacs. I think we can all relate to that sometimes, when we see something we really love and we absolutely must have it now, we look it up and we go to the shop, etc. Other words for it you may have heard: compulsive shopping, compulsive consumption, compulsive buying, addictive buying, spendaholism was a new one to me. But essentially the idea is it's uncontrolled. You know how much money you have, you're not mentally ill in any other way, and yet you're spending far more than you can afford. This is a beautiful head, magnetic resonance imaging piece of artwork by Angela Palmer, who has an exhibition soon. And I just thought I'd put it there to remind you that it's all to do with the brain and decision making. Are you going to buy something you can't afford or not? So diagnostic criteria, they're quite old, but they still stand. How do we know? Well, the compulsive buying as a problematic buying behavior that is uncontrollable, distressing. It's got to be distressing at some level, either when you're doing it or afterwards when you've got no money and you think, what an idiot, I shouldn't have spent it. Time consuming, to the point where you may actually neglect, for example, your schoolwork. You may neglect your university coursework. I see quite a lot of that in behavioral addictions. People fail and drop out of university or lose their jobs because of the time-consuming nature of what they do. And importantly, the result is family, social, vocational or financial difficulties. There has to be some adverse consequence to any behavioral addiction, because if there isn't, if you like jogging and you decide to run several marathons, you could say it's time consuming, but unless there is a significant negative consequence, I wouldn't say that's an addiction. Now, it needs to be out of a context of mania or hypomania. These are states in which you lose touch with reality, and you might think, some of my patients in the past, when I was doing a lot of psychiatric work in hospitals, used to think they were God, or they were Jesus, or they were the owner of Harrods, in which case they thought they had money. If you think you've got money because you've lost touch with reality and you spend it, that's not shopping addiction. Okay, maladaptive shopping impulses or behavior is indicated by at least one of the following: frequent preoccupation with buying or impulses to buy. Now, preoccupation means that all that happens is that before the act, you think about it, you get excited about it, you plan it in your head, then you're doing it, so you're preoccupied with doing it, and afterwards you're preoccupied with how did you do it and how enjoyable it was. And that's the same for any behavioral addiction. And so irresistible, intrusive, and senseless in the end. Frequent buying of more than can be afforded, and buying of items that are not needed necessarily. There's marked distress, time-consuming, as I said, and occupational function, financial problems, obviously with indebtedness and bankruptcy. So the 4 stages, we have anticipation with the urge, preparation, as people prepare to go shopping and spending, where to go, what to wear. Shopping is the most important phase, with individuals experiencing a temporary relief or a great sense of excitement or even sexual feeling. All these have been reported. And the temporary relief is important because, in a way, when you think about the sort of reward mechanism, the feedback loop, is that relief that people are looking for that will drive them to do it again when it builds up again. And it's the same with porn addiction. You know, people can go through a cycle like that. And the spending. And soon after buying the item, people start feeling frustrated with their actions. And that's when they need consoling. And that's when the tension starts building again. The goods are little or no use to people, and the behavior can take a chronic course with frequent episodes of shopping. In contrast to normal buyers who plan and calculate normally and budget before they shop, these people are acting on impulse and without prior planning. Now, things have changed a bit, because, of course, this kind of thinking was originally started in the mid-90s. But if you think about eBay now, put your hand up if you've bought something impulsively on eBay. You know, you've seen it, and within half an hour, you've bought it. Anyone done this? Yeah, so the whole room has done this, me included. Now, is that impulsive buying, or is it just that we are very quick now in our decision-making and our selection of what we need and what we are looking for, because everything is so targeted? If you know you're looking for a blue bag and it's got to be shiny and it's got to be quite large, that's what you can get because the machine is doing the work for you. So that's not necessarily impulsive if you then click the button immediately. It's only if you then buy another 5 that the problem arises. And, you know, that's what we see sometimes. And that brings me on to the next bit. Why buy another 5 blue bags when you've just bought one? Well, because sometimes the buying is just a way of manifesting your unease and your dissatisfaction with your current life, psychologically or practically. There can be poor self-esteem that drives it, distress, anxiety, depression, OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorders, are all things that can fuel this behavior that is so difficult to understand. You know, you work so hard, you save your money in order to spend it on something good, and then you use it to buy something totally useless that you didn't really need in the first place. So why do you do that? Well, maybe in the same way that you may repetitively do something like turn on and off a light switch when you don't actually need to do that. Or in the same way that you may end up binging in the evening after a whole day of being good in terms of your eating, because you have a rising sense of distress and frustration and tension, and only eating large amounts of bread or ice cream settles that. And I know some of you in this room will identify with that, because binge eating is actually quite common. And other impulse control disorders are also sharing similarities in terms of the neuroscience of decision making and the inability to delay gratification, and therefore the dysfunctional reward pathways that can drive people to do the wrong thing at the wrong time too quickly. We find compulsive buying throughout the world, according to research, but mainly high-income countries. And I don't need to go into the whys. I think these are quite clear. You need some sort of surplus to be able to then use up the money. In terms of prevalence, 2 to 8% of the general population. I think that's too high. I really do. Pathological gambling is 0.9% of the population. And that is measuring significant problems with gambling. This next study is looking at 2,500 adults, and again 5.8%. I think it's too high. It's possible that people are asking, have you ever done this, rather than in the last 12 months, or that people who are responding to the adverts that are seeking people to participate in these surveys are people who in any way are more interested in shopping. So there's going to, I would imagine the prevalence is significantly lower than that. And a higher female presence. And shopping plays a stronger emotional, psychological and symbolic role for women than men, and this has been given by Dittmar as a possible explanation. Now we have 18 to 30 years of age as a compulsive buying starting, and the potential onset as an age when people have more financial control. So potentially when they leave home, they have their own credit cards, and now with laptops, etc., things are easier in terms of spending your money if you can. But I think overall, if you have the control, parental control or some control within the household, it's less likely to happen, because people see you coming home with 10 handbags, they go, where have you been? What have you done this afternoon, instead of being at university or at school? So, you know, you need that sort of freedom to misbehave in a way, which happens about 18 to 30. The course is continuous. Some people report decades of compulsive buying. So once you've got it, the problem is that that tunnel in your brain that goes from the center of your brain to the action of compulsive buying has now been drilled. And so even if you go into remission and you're well behaved, unfortunately, you're far more likely to behave in that way again than your next person down the line who has never experienced it. There's evidence that it runs in families, but whether that is genetic, as for example problem gambling and all the other addictions, or whether that's just seeing one of your parents come home with lots of bags, I'm not sure. We need to have a look at that. There are neurotransmitters involved, such as serotonin, dopamine, cortisol, endogenous opioids, that are all present, and there are changes in those that are identified when we look at an imbalance between an overstimulated drive state and the impairment in inhibition of reward processing. So we're looking at frontal lobes dysfunction, because the frontal lobes are our brakes. They tell us when not to do something that we really, really want to do. And when you look at teenagers and young people in their early 20s, because the maturation of the frontal lobes occurs like this, it takes longer for human beings to have their frontal lobes fully formed. So they're driving cars, but their frontal lobes are not fully formed. So there's an issue here, and this may be part of the issue. There's an exaggerated craving and urge state owing to alterations in the dopamine system and decreased activation in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and mesocortical limbic dopamine system in problem gamblers that may be very, very similar with shopping addicts. I've talked about the presence of depression, but these are high prevalences, you know, affected 70% of people had reported depression before the onset of compulsive buying. That's why I'm wondering, is it really an addiction as such, or is it a manifestation in a compulsive way of a really difficult state that it's hard to contain? Certainly bipolar affective disorder, the mania I talked about, is not the main driver here, and that in itself is a wonderful a piece of information that research has given us. People are not buying because they've lost touch with reality and they think they have lots of money. Up to 41% of individuals had anxiety disorders, so if it's not depression, it might be anxiety. And then what about kleptomania? Are these people stealing the goods? No, they are buying them. But there seems to be an interesting relationship between kleptomania and compulsive buying. Grant and Potenza, two of the great gurus based in America in terms of behavioral addiction, they've also looked at all sorts of other behavioral addictions. They looked at 95 adults with kleptomania and found that there was, you know, roughly 10 to 15% of people were also compulsive buyers. And I find that fascinating. I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but it may be that I will you know, try and do something in the UK. It's always good to try and apply American research into the UK, because we behave differently. We don't always follow the same course of decision-making paths, and certainly with all our gambling research, the results are not always replicated. All research points to the fact that about a quarter of compulsive buyers either suffered from a drug dependence like cannabis and benzodiazepines or drank too much. Now, of course, if you think that they're also depressed and anxious, they may be using benzodiazepines to calm themselves down, equally the cannabis, or they're drinking to self-medicate. So all this is linked up somehow, but we're not quite sure exactly how. Just I'll briefly touch on this. People have looked at citalopram, which is an antidepressant, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, but we use it a lot with our patients for depression. And some people responded positively. However, of course, because some people had depression and they were not excluded from the trial, this could be easily explainable. So more research needs to happen on that. Equally, some people were given naltrexone, and reduced urges in terms of shopping and compulsive shopping were shown, and naltrexone can also help with problem gambling. Don't worry about this. This is just an abstract from research, but I just wanted to say that individuals with compulsive buying experience problems in several cognitive domains, supporting a likely neurobiological overlap between this and other behavioral and substance addictions, which is very exciting if you are interested in behavioral addictions. We know that cognitive behavioral therapy helps. In fact, at the moment, it seems to be the best intervention that we have found. When the randomized controlled trials of CBT took place for compulsive buying disorder, it concluded that disorder-specific group therapy can improve the disorder. So if you concentrate on that rather than on problems in general, psychological problems in general, but you really focus on the stimulus control in relation to the shopping. For example, you don't go down this street, you go down a different street, you remove the shopping website from your laptop. These kinds of things can be very helpful. And equally for other addictions, other behavioral addictions in particular, if you make them specific to the illness, you have a much higher success rate. Self-help, this is probably my last slide, I think. 4 steps to control your compulsive spending, realizing you've got a problem, and maybe through some of the questions I have put up, some of you might be thinking, yeah, actually that is me. Cut up the credit cards, get rid of the checkbook. That's, it's part of stimulus control, is how do you prevent yourself from being able to enact some of the behaviors that your mind is pushing you towards doing. And so if you want to buy but you don't have the credit card handy, some of our patients hand them to their parents or to their spouse to avoid that compulsive shopping or that compulsive gambling. It works very, very well. It's very restrictive and you can't do it for life, but you can certainly do it for a period of 6 months so that you put some distance between the toxic behavior and your brain. Shopping with friends, shopping with relatives is very helpful. Actually, I had a really brilliant idea last week. I was at a lecture at Goldsmith and I was talking about internet addiction, and the man before me has invented a robot, and they're like the biggest robot company in the world, and this robot was rather small, and it could help people with dementia. So I said to him, if I could order 2,000 of them and they could be very big, they could accompany my patients. And when my patients want to do something really bad, like take drugs or whatever, the robot could just prevent them from doing anything. But interestingly, he actually liked the idea of using that robot for something to do with addiction. So we have started some sort of embryonic collaboration that will go somewhere, probably less physical and more mental, but I like the idea of a robot telling you not to spend your money because it's got knowledge of what you're doing with your credit card. Okay, so the last thing and the most important, if you find things that are really good for you mentally, that are really positive for your life, the life of those around you, and are constructive intellectually or emotionally, then that's the best way to get out of a situation that is a compulsive addiction, such as shopping, gaming, sex, gambling, whatever. And introducing that activity back into your life, even now that you may feel that activity holds no pleasure anymore because all you're thinking about is your compulsion. But reintroducing it is the way forward, and gradually the natural feedback reward mechanism in your brain will take over again. Why am I saying this? because I know so, because I have 1,000 people a year referred to my clinic, and 80% of those get better. Thank you very much.
Thanks
Questions
very much,
later?
Henriette. Yes,
Yes.
Avno. Yeah.
Well, I come here with some trepidation. I feel like Daniel, not exactly in the lion's den, but in a den of lionesses. So I'm going to also start with the individual mind or individual mindset, but I'll try to place it in a larger social and economic context. I'll start with myopia. So what is myopia? Let's look at the rational consumer. The rational consumer sees two objects, or two payoffs, if you wish. One is 120 pounds, and the other is 100 pounds. They're not exactly the same distance, but she correctly perceives that 120 is more than 100. More is better than less. This is called This is one definition of rationality. Now, what is this diagram actually? This is an optical diagram, yes? She's looking at things. What I want to say is that our attitude to time is similar to our attitude to the way we perceive light. So this is an optical analogy to time. So think of distance in the optical case as being time. And now we're going to see another kind of consumer. This is the impulsive consumer, and what's happened here is that as she gets closer, there's a preference reversal. You see that previously the blue line was above the green line, and as she gets closer, the lines get reversed. And suddenly, 100 pounds looks like more than 120 pounds. Did you see that? Yes. Anyway, I'm so proud of this. So I want to show it again. So this is the impulsive consumer. And the point is that the decision is not stable. Smaller sooner is preferred to larger later. And that behavior, that phenomenon, is validated in a whole range of disciplines. I draw mostly on social psychology, but there are half a dozen disciplines in which this has been validated, including animal behavior. So you don't even need to be human to behave like that. And so what we have here is a kind of novelty bias. Yes, it's closer, it's more novel, and therefore we prefer it just for that reason. These things are also called cognitive biases. So cognitive bias is not thinking straight. So this person is actually she is thinking straight, it's a straight line, but she has a novelty bias. And you can think of that, if you think of rationality as normative, as the right thing to do, then this cognitive bias gets in the way of our better selves. There's also some kind of maybe moral failing here. So what's the problem? The problem is an intertemporal dilemma, yes? Our choice is not consistent over time. We want one thing at one point in time and another thing at another point in time. This is a commitment problem. If we want to become consistent, the problem is how to sacrifice something now in return for something better later. Now, the social psychologists say that we're not naturally rational, we're actually naturally myopic. That our natural mode of calculation is actually myopia rather than rationality. Now, if we're myopic and if we want different things at different time scales, well, you can say we can always be myopic and always choose the inferior option. But since we're smarter than that, we already know that there's a better option down the road. We still have to make that choice somehow. So we want to lock ourselves into the future payoff to prevent ourselves from yielding to our shopping addiction, if it is, or whatever. And how do we do that? We fall back on society, on conventions, on norms, on institutions, on what I call, I didn't invent this term, but I call this commitment devices. These commitment devices are already there on the shelf, available for us to use. They've been evolved by society, they've been proven, and we can make use of them to overcome our myopia. Commitment devices. So there are two types. One is personal strategies, in other words, various forms of self-control, attention control, for example. So if you want to slim, it's a good idea to lock up the really sweet things and maybe to give the key to somebody else. Personal rules, no eating between meals. That's a personal rule. Bright lines, likewise. I won't eat anything after dinner. Or hostaging. Hostaging is giving the key to somebody else. The other is social strategies, technologies. We let someone else enforce good behavior on us. And in fact, when you start looking around, you'll see that our civilization is full of these social commitment technologies. Indeed, you can go further and say that is what civilization is about. So look at counting, yes? So actually being able to count is a commitment device. The calendar, the clock, the seventh-day rest, money, the gold standard, you know, you can read it off the screen. And what I want to say here is that civilization is a web of commitments, is a web of commitment devices. It's a way of not yielding to our immediate impulses. Now, each one of these commitments, take pensions, for example. Yes, pensions we save for a lifetime. We postpone consumption for a lifetime in order to have something to spend 40 years hence or 30 years hence. These commitment technologies, commitment devices, take time to develop. They're not available ready-made. Society has taken time to perfect them. Let me give you an example of the clock. The clock is, if our problem is intertemporal optimization, doing the right thing at the right time, we need to know what the time is. So we have the clock, and initially the clock was a public clock at the top of a tower over the church or maybe the town hall. And then we had one clock per household, the big grandfather clock. And then each one of us had a personal watch. And then the archetypal commitment device is the alarm clock, of course, which makes sure you get up, make sure that you get out of bed on time. And the latest tweak on that, quite a long time ago now, is, so that's the alarm clock, is snooze control. So you can overcome the alarm clock. You develop techniques for decommitment by falling asleep again, but you have the snooze control to make sure that you wake up again. So all this is to say that commitment is difficult. It's slow and difficult and costly to build up. Now, the abundance of affluence undermines our commitment devices, undermines our ability to overcome these impulses. So let's look at eating. So in the 1950s, if you wanted to eat, then you had to eat at home, and you could only eat 3 times a day. And the cooking was, by definition, no more than average. I hope you get this statistical point. It doesn't mean that your mother was a bad cook, but the expectation was that your mother would be no more than an average cook. So what we have after that is a flow of novelty, fast food. Think at the extreme, the street food or fast food. It overwhelms the existing commitment device. It overwhelms the family meal. So these days, only a minority of meals are eaten by households around a single table. They're eaten in all sorts of other places. So you can eat anytime, you can eat any place. This is called grazing. If the family meal kept you slim, then it's no longer available. That commitment device has been undermined by affluence. So novelty introduces a short-term bias, a myopic bias. Yes, new things appear. You don't have any commitment devices to resist them. And so you are tempted by them. And the thing about these powerful immediate impulses is that you get habituated to them, so it takes a stronger dose in order for you to derive the same kind of satisfaction. So short-term bias, myopic bias, also means that you enjoy things less. You enjoy them less, so you want more of them, so you consume too much of them. So without the protection of commitment devices, our capacity for enjoyment is swamped by too much stimulus, and we become habituated. Now, on the other side, the people who try to get us to consume things compete with each other by selling us arousal and leapfrogging each other with arousal. So this is arousal leapfrogging. Let's take an example of this: club music. Yes. So when I had kids of that age, they used to go to clubs and jump up and down and seemingly to enjoy it. But, you know, if I would venture into a club like that, I would be rendered deaf pretty much immediately, yes? So the club proprietors compete with each other by raising the volume all the time. And people who go regularly get habituated to that. Only later do they discover that they can't hear anything, but that's another issue. McDonald's hamburger, you know, the hamburger people compete with each other by offering large, super large, big size, super size, and so on at a lower and lower price. And the fashion cycle also, I've added this because this is a fashion college. I'm not actually entirely sure about this, but yes, I remember a time, this is a very long time ago, this just came to me now, when this competition to have larger and larger skin exposure ended up with topless dresses. This is a fairly short-term phenomenon in the 70s, but some people here might remember it. It's that kind of competition. So the point is that the flow of innovation undermines commitment devices. So this innovation, this novelty that we're told is such a wonderful thing, actually undermines our capacity to enjoy things. And let's have an example, the kind of trade-off that we have there. So let's think of cheap food. Food is getting cheaper, but it's becoming more and more difficult to present a slim figure. Yes, that's the kind of trade-off we have. So here's an example. The Economist publishes every year, I don't know whether you know this, publishes a comparative price of the Big Mac in a whole range of countries. So they've very kindly given me the data. And you can see that in the period I'm covering, just 10 years between 1994 and 2004, the price of the Big Mac is declining. So this is novelty, and this is affluence, yes? I can, for the same amount of pay, I can afford 2 Big Macs where I could only eat one before. What are the consequences of this? This is a measure of obesity, also in a large number of countries. Actually, I'm cheating here a bit because I'm starting in 1970. But if you start in 1995, you'll see it's still going up, actually at a faster rate than the price of the Big Mac is going down. And so this is a demonstration of the phenomenon that I'm describing, how affluence has this undesirable, unintended, undesirable consequence of making us look less attractive than we might be otherwise. So this is one manifestation of the so-called paradox of happiness. Paradox of happiness is rising income. Income is rising, but well-being is not rising. Now you can well say, I haven't seen income rising for quite a long time now. That's yet another problem. But this is well documented in studies, in surveys of well-being, that rising income, being rich doesn't make you happy. Actually, it does, but that's I have to qualify this in a variety of ways. But nevertheless, as a social phenomenon. That's over time, that's true. In the cross-section, it's not entirely true, but over time, it's basically true. The reason, I would argue, is that novelty swamps the capacity for pleasure. So if we're richer, we can afford more novelty, and that undermines our capacity for happiness, for well-being, for pleasure. If you accept this as valid, then the problem is not how to consume more, it's actually how to consume less. So the problem is not how to maximize consumption, but how to slow it down, how to pace it. Under affluence, you might say, scarcity becomes scarce. We need things to be more spaced, to come at a weaker flow at us, for arousal to be downgraded. So you could say the objective flow is to adapt the flow of stimulus to our capacity to absorb it. So we want an optimal flow of psychic reward, an optimal flow of stimulation. So how do we do that? How do we pace arousal? We need to use commitment devices. Here's a quote I like very much from a person, a social psychologist who actually developed a lot of these ideas. So the main value of other people is to pace one's own self-reward. Well, I sometimes think that other people have other value as well, but if you think that, not going out shopping is important, then if you have a spouse who will tell you, not today, then that might be useful. So one of the things that slow us down is formality. So I'm a fellow of an Oxford college, and we have something called High Table, which is a dinner which, in its full form, takes about 3 hours to complete. Yes, so first I won't go into the details, how we managed to stretch this out, but this is a very formal occasion, and I could get exactly the same number of calories in about 5 minutes by stuffing my face in front of the fridge. Yes? So this shows you the value of formality. Let's take language. Pretty much every European language, except English, by the way, maybe we're not part of Europe, as some people say, makes a distinction between the third person and the second person, the sie and the du, the tu and the whatever it is. So this is formality. Yes, it slows down. It, for example, slows down intimacy. Now, intimacy is very nice, but you can have too much of it. So maybe we want to slow it down. Table manners. Table manners is a good example. So we don't stuff our face. We look for the knife and the fork and try to maneuver them and so on. That slows us down. Formal dress. So, you put on a tie, some of you at any rate. The alternation of work days and rest days. We could work 7 days a week, and in fact there's strong pressure from neoliberal capitalism to make us work 24/7. That's a fairly new concept, 24/7. But now, in the olden days, we had these commitment devices of Sundays, festivals, holidays to slow us down. Social status is something that slows you down. Romantic love takes time to develop and so on. If you remember your Jane Austen, it's quite a drawn-out process with an uncertain finish. Or luxury goods. Why are luxury goods commitment devices? Because we cannot have a lot of them. That's the definition of luxury. So that slows us down. So I could have, maybe if I were rich enough, I could have a new Ford Escort in my drive every Monday, but I greatly prefer to have a Rolls Royce once a year. Yes, that's the way a luxury good slows you down. Art, literature, music are all slow you down. It takes time to learn to appreciate it. It takes even more time to learn to master it. Say, to play an instrument properly is something that most of us maybe tried, but very few of us have reached the pinnacle. So art, literature, music slow us down. And there are various constraints there. So this is a quote, excellent quote, social interaction obligations of reciprocity and kinship, social hierarchy, place an obstacle between people and their desires, and maintain the edge of these desires. So you might wonder who wrote this wonderful quote. I have to say it's myself. And now we get to fashion. So what would I know about fashion? More than you would think, because I supervised a doctorate by a Japanese scholar, Shinobu Majima, who wrote a doctorate on the British women's outerwears industry during these years. So some of this work is, what I'm going to show is taken from that. So the first thing to point out is that women's clothing is a normal good. In other words, the consumption of clothing rises together with income. Not more than income, not less than income, but rises more or less together with income. When women have more money, they buy more clothes, but proportionate to how much more money they have. But what kind of clothes do they buy? They buy more clothes at a lower price. So they buy, you could say, inferior clothes. So the strategy might be called a disposable strategy. They go shopping more frequently, but since they spend the same amount of money, they're actually buying inferior clothes. Say the t-shirt strategy, you can call it maybe. So this is data from, this particular one is from an article by Majima and another friend of mine, Julia Twigg. And each line here is a cohort. And what the vertical scale measures is how frequently they go shopping. So you can say that, you can see that the younger cohort on the same incomes go shopping much more frequently. This is just a statistical illustration of the point I made before. And here's another one. I like this. This is a kind of hybrid graph. So the bottom curve shows women's wear expenditure as percentage of income. In other words, it shows that there's no change at all. Women spend the same proportion of their income, between 10 and 20%, on clothing, the same in 1961 as in 2001. The second curve above it is the frequency of purchase. And you can see that that's increased by 1.5 times. 150% increase. So they go shopping much more frequently on the same proportion of income. And the others are various demographics, so more of them are childless and more are employed and fewer are married, but that's not immediately relevant. So what this shows is a kind of strategy of disposability in clothing. Now the question is why? So this is what Majima says. Women were making more frequent but smaller expenditures now than before, and the gap between the better and the worse off had narrowed towards the end of the century, partly due to clothing price deflation, a regular discount at the end of each season. So what she's saying is that this is a good thing, because when everyone is wearing a t-shirt, you can't tell who is rich and who is poor. So maybe this is socially progressive. So when I scratch my head and ask why are they doing this, I ask, what do women want? You know, this is the perennial question. You're much better equipped to answer this than I am. But I say women are seeking distinction. Yes, when you go out to buy clothing, you're seeking distinction. And you can achieve this distinction by buying something new. So that distinguishes you from somebody else if you buy something new. So that's one way of doing this. But so you want to be different, but perhaps not too different. So that is what the problem of fashion is about. Now, if you're an economist, you say, why are you worried about that? This is consumer choice, and we do not query consumer choice. The consumer is sovereign. Let them buy whatever they like, and what they like is good by definition. The riposte to that is to say that they do this under heavy influence of marketing, and also the point I made before of this mechanism. They're not rational, or they're only partly rational, but they're quite powerfully subject to the short-term bias into habituation. So that actually affects these choices. So this is a riposte to the argument that consumers are just being rational and it's none of your business. So if we're saying that maybe consumers are not always doing what is always best for them, even by their own account, even from their own point of view, then what strategies are available for them? So what are the alternatives? So if you're looking for distinction, then distinction is available through novelty. We've seen that already, but it is also available, for example, by durability. This is a Rolls-Royce strategy. So you go for the Rolls-Royce instead of the T-shirt, and that's not necessarily more costly because you make your purchases less frequent. So what we have here is high cost as a commitment device. This, I said, is one of the ways of slowing ourselves down, going for high cost. And that opens a possibility. If it's high cost, then we can do craft production rather than mass production. If that is a desirable payoff. When we say desirable, in what sense? We're looking for ways of achieving distinction. I know that sustainability is a theme here. So if we go for durability, that's definitely a sustainability attribute. Yes, so that is also a strategy which is maybe more sustainable, less wasteful. Now, I'm afraid this is not going to happen, or not universally going to happen, unless we radically change our thinking, as was suggested at the last Neal's Yard lecture. But radically changing our thinking very rarely happens, I'm afraid. So what are the problems? One problem is that incomes are actually declining. Everyone's income is declining. Probably your incomes are declining. So we can't afford to buy Rolls Royces. We have to do with T-shirts. And the other is that much of the cheap production benefits from very low labor cost. And it takes very powerful commitment to overcome the temptation of the cheap price. The market is really against this strategy. So the challenge here, the challenge maybe for fashionistas, is to create commitment devices, and that's not impossible. So it's a kind of marketing or branding opportunity, and let me give you an example of this. So take, for example, cola. There's also an addiction to cola. I suffer from it. And if I want the proper cola, in other words, Coca-Cola, I can go to Sainsbury and pay £2 for a 2-litre bottle. But Sainsbury also sells its own cola, which you pay 18p for a 2-litre bottle. I challenge you on a tasting test to distinguish between the two. They're probably made in the same factory. So you can see the brand value alone is worth £1.82. By the way, I did this test with my students. I brought them the 2 bottles, and none of them would touch brand X. So it just shows you how powerful the marketing conditioning is. But what that shows, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because if you're going for the Rolls-Royce strategy, then this is a tool you can use here. So the challenge is that of marketing or consciousness raising. And so in the apparel market, at any rate, durable, distinctive, or achieving distinction by means of durability may be a viable strategy for making and for selling to middle-income consumers. This is not a strategy that will replace all others. This will not be a radical revolution. All I'm saying is that the opportunity is there. It's been done in other areas. That's what marketing generally does. And every journey begins with one step. And maybe that is a step to follow. Thank you very much.